The store's shelves cast shadows that didn't match their shapes. I noticed it the way you notice a picture frame that's slightly crooked, something the brain tries to correct before it decides to question it. It was a quiet night, the kind of late hour where convenience stores stop feeling like businesses and start feeling like aquariums. Everything sealed behind glass. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. The refrigeration units breathing slowly along the back wall. I had come in for coffee. The clerk was in the back room. I could hear the faint clink of bottles being sorted, the soft rustle of cardboard. Otherwise, the store was empty. I walked down the snack aisle, half awake, letting my hand trail along the edge of the metal shelving. The lip of the shelf was cool and slightly rough where the paint had worn thin. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, quickly, like a blink. That's when I saw it. The shelves cast shadows across the tile floor, but the shadows weren't straight. Each row of shelving should have made a clean, rectangular band of darkness. Instead, the shadows bent inward, like elbows. Some tapered, some forked. One shelf's shadow curved gently toward the drinks cooler as if pulled by gravity. I stopped walking. The hum of the refrigeration units filled the silence. For a moment, I assumed it was the lights. Fluorescent tubes can do strange things when they're dying: double shadows, uneven diffusion. I stepped sideways and looked up. 3 light fixtures, all steady. I looked back down. The shadows were still wrong. The shelf beside me held bags of chips. The metal edge ran perfectly straight. I ran my fingers along it again just to be sure. Straight. But on the floor, its shadow dipped downward halfway along, like a sagging beam. I crouched and stared at it. The longer I looked, the more the shapes seemed deliberate. Not random distortion, more like bad copies. As if something had tried to redraw the shelves from memory and gotten the geometry slightly off. I stood up again. The lights flickered once more. Soft, almost polite. The shadows didn't change. I picked up a bag of chips and held it away from the shelf. The bag's shadow appeared on the tile exactly where it should. Crisp. Normal. I lowered it. The shelf shadow was still warped. I told myself it was the angle. Stores at night can play tricks with depth. Mirrors on coolers, glossy tile reflecting light from strange directions. I stepped into the aisle beside it and looked from a different perspective. The shelves stayed straight. The shadows stayed wrong. Behind me, a refrigerator motor kicked on with a low mechanical growl. Cold air drifted through the aisle carrying the faint smell of plastic and citrus cleaner. I tried to laugh quietly to myself. "You're tired," I muttered. The sound of my own voice felt strange in the store. Too loud, too present. I started walking again. The next aisle held canned goods. Beans, soups, sauces stacked in perfect metallic rows. I stopped halfway down. The shelves here cast shadows too. And these were worse. The shadow of the top shelf stretched across the floor like a long black plank. But halfway across the tile it split into 2 branches, like a river dividing around an invisible island. I stepped forward slowly. The hum of the store seemed louder now. Fluorescent buzz. Refrigeration motors. A faint electrical ticking from the lights. I reached down and placed my hand directly into the split in the shadow. My fingers rested on cold tile. Nothing else. I moved my hand slowly along the floor. The shadow didn't move with it. Of course it wouldn't. Shadows don't behave like that. Still, something about the way it divided felt intentional. The branches curved slightly toward opposite ends of the aisle, as if reaching. I stood up quickly. For a moment I had the strange impression that the shadows were reacting to where I stood. But when I stepped backward, they stayed exactly where they were. Static. Incorrect. The clerk coughed faintly somewhere in the back room. Normal sounds. Ordinary space. I told myself I was overthinking the lighting. But the deeper I walked into the store, the harder that explanation became. The freezer aisle was the worst. Tall glass doors ran along the wall, each one glowing with cold white light. Frozen pizzas, ice cream tubs, frost creeping along the edges of the frames. The shelves across from them were narrow racks of packaged noodles and instant meals. The light from the freezers threw long shadows from the shelves across the aisle. Those shadows should have stretched straight toward the registers. Instead they leaned, every single one angled slightly toward the center of the aisle, like compass needles pointing north. I stood between them, rows of dark lines converging toward my shoes. The fluorescent lights flickered again. This time the flicker lasted longer, just long enough for the entire store to dim and swell back to brightness. During that moment of dimness, the shadows shifted. Not dramatically, just a small tightening, like a muscle flexing. When the light returned fully, they were still again. My chest felt tight. I crouched slowly and examined the floor more closely. The tile was clean and glossy, nothing on it. No stains or reflections that could explain the distortion. But from this angle something else became visible. The shadows didn't line up with the shelves above them. They were offset, not by much, just a few inches. I stood very still. If the shadows were cast by the shelves, they should begin exactly at the base of the metal frames. These ones began slightly away from them, as if the shelves weren't the source. I reached out and touched the edge of the nearest rack. Cold metal, perfectly straight. Its shadow began several inches behind it. I leaned forward. The hum of the freezers deepened, vibrating faintly through the floor. My eyes followed the shadow's length. Halfway down the aisle it bent, not toward the lights, toward me, a slow inward curve that stopped just short of my feet. My throat felt dry. I took one step backward. The shadow did not move, but another shadow from a different shelf reached slightly farther forward now. Not quickly, just farther, like something adjusting its position. I straightened and looked up. The shelves were unchanged. Perfect lines, perfect angles. Only their shadows seemed restless. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The store dimmed, and in that half-second of darkness, the shadows lengthened. When the lights came back, they had returned to their original positions. I wasn't imagining it. Something was testing the space. A soft bell chimed at the front door. I turned quickly. A man stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket. He nodded absently and walked toward the drink coolers without looking at me. Normal. Relief washed through me. Another person in the store made everything feel less strange, less personal. I watched him open the cooler door and grab a bottle of soda. Then I looked down again. The shadows were different now. They weren't pointing toward me anymore. They were pointing toward him. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in their angles, like the slow turning of sunflowers. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. The man walked down the aisle toward the register, passing between the leaning shadows without noticing them. He set the bottle on the counter. The clerk finally emerged from the back room, yawning. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words over the hum of the refrigeration units. The shadows remained angled toward the counter. Every one of them, watching. The man paid and left. The bell chimed again as the door closed behind him. The clerk returned to the back room. The store fell silent once more. I looked down at the floor. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, the shadows began turning back toward me. Not stretching, not sliding, just reorienting, like heads turning in unison. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing the aisle in a brief pulse of pale light. For a moment the shelves looked taller. Too tall. Their shadows reached nearly to my feet. Then the lights stabilized. Everything froze again. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet breathing of the machines, watching the shadows wait. Finally, I walked toward the front of the store, careful not to step directly into any of them. The bell chimed as I pushed the door open. Cold night air rushed in. I stepped outside and turned back once. Through the glass windows, I could see the aisles clearly under the white fluorescent glow. The shelves looked perfectly normal. Perfect lines, perfect rows. But their shadows were not cast behind them anymore. They were facing the windows. Long dark shapes angled toward the glass, toward the parking lot, toward me. And even from outside, I had the quiet, steady feeling that they weren't shadows at all. They were just the direction the store was looking. The customer asked if the north entrance was open. We only have one door. He said it politely, like someone asking where the restroom is. I was standing behind the register, half listening to the quiet rhythm of the store. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that thin electric way they always do at night. The refrigerators along the back wall exhaled steady bursts of cold air every few seconds. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a delivery truck idling across the street. I looked up from the receipt paper I'd been tearing. "The North Entrance?" I said. He nodded. "Yes. Is it open tonight?" For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. People ask strange questions in convenience stores at midnight, but they're usually about cigarettes or lottery tickets. "We just have the front door," I said. I gestured toward it. A single glass door with a bell above it. You can see the whole parking lot through it. You can see the highway lights beyond the lot, and the dull reflection of the aisles stretching behind you. The customer turned and looked at the door. Then he looked back at me. "That one's the west entrance," he said. He said it calmly, not correcting me, just stating something obvious. I smiled in the polite, tired way you do with customers who might be confused. "No," I said. "That's the only entrance." He didn't respond right away. He looked past me instead, toward the aisles. The store is small enough that you can see most of it from the counter. 6 aisles of shelves, evenly spaced. Coolers along the back. A narrow hallway to the employee storage room behind the register. Everything in straight lines. Everything easy to understand. "The north entrance is usually open this late," he said quietly. The refrigerators hummed behind him. A thin ribbon of cold air drifted through the aisle between us. "We don't have one," I said. He nodded slowly, like someone accepting a minor inconvenience. "Right," he said. He picked up a bottle of iced tea from the cooler and placed it on the counter. While I scanned it, I watched his reflection in the glass of the refrigerator doors behind him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking down aisle 4. That aisle runs straight toward the back wall where the freezers are. Instant noodles, canned soup, dry goods. A simple aisle. But the way he was watching it made it feel longer than it was. "You sure it's closed?" he asked. "The North Entrance?" "Yes." My fingers paused on the register keys. "Yes," I said again. He nodded once more, thoughtful. "Strange," he murmured. I handed him his change. He left through the only door we have. The bell chimed softly when it closed. The store settled back into its quiet hum. For a while I forgot about it. Night shifts stretch time in strange ways. Minutes feel thick. The sounds of machines start to blend together until the whole building feels like it's breathing slowly around you. I straightened a rack of candy bars near the counter. Restocked napkins by the coffee machine. Walked the aisles to pass the time. It was during that walk that something started bothering me. Not a thought, a shape. When you work in the same place every night, you get used to the geometry of it. You know how long an aisle feels when you walk it. You know how the lights reflect off the tile floor. You know exactly how many steps it takes to reach the back wall. Something about aisle 4 felt longer than usual. Not dramatically longer, just stretched. I walked down it slowly. The fluorescent light above flickered once, briefly dimming the shelves. Instant noodles, canned beans, plastic packets of rice. The shelves were perfectly aligned. But the aisle didn't end exactly where I expected. I stopped halfway down. The back freezers were still there, frosted glass doors glowing softly, but they felt a little farther away. I took another step. The hum of the refrigeration units grew louder. The air got colder. For a moment I wondered if I'd simply misjudged the distance. I walked to the end of the aisle. Everything looked normal. Still, something felt off. I turned around and looked back toward the register. From this angle, the counter looked farther away than it should. The door beyond it glowed with the yellow light from the parking lot. The bell above it hung perfectly still. I stood there listening to the fluorescent hum. Then I noticed something else. There was a faint draft, cold air drifting through the aisle. But the freezers were behind me now. The draft was coming from ahead, from the direction of the counter. I walked back slowly. Halfway down the aisle, the draft disappeared. By the time I reached the register again, the air felt normal. I told myself it was just the coolers cycling, machines breathing, buildings settling. Still, when I looked down aisle 4 again, it seemed slightly misaligned. Not crooked, just pointed somewhere else. The next customer came in about 20 minutes later. A woman in a gray jacket. She grabbed a bag of chips and brought it to the counter. As I scanned it, she glanced toward the aisles. "Is the north entrance closed tonight?" she asked. My hands stopped moving. "What?" She gestured vaguely past me. "The north one." My car's parked closer to that side. The fluorescent lights hummed louder suddenly, or maybe I was just hearing them more clearly. "We only have the one door," I said. She frowned slightly. "No, there's another one." "Where?" She looked confused by the question. "Back there," she said. She pointed directly at aisle 4. My throat tightened. "That just goes to the freezers," I said. She looked down the aisle again. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she shrugged lightly. "Maybe I'm thinking of another store." She paid and left. The bell chimed. The store was quiet again. I stared down aisle 4. The shelves were straight. The lights were steady. But something about the end of the aisle felt darker now. Like the light didn't quite reach the back wall anymore. I walked toward it again. The tile floor clicked softly under my shoes. Halfway down the aisle, the cold draft returned. Stronger this time. I could hear the refrigerators humming, but the sound seemed misdirected, like it was coming from somewhere farther away than the back wall. I kept walking. The shelves beside me felt slightly farther apart. Not visibly, but in the way sound moved between them. The hum echoed more than it should. When I reached the end of the aisle, I stopped. The freezers were still there. Frosted glass. Stacks of frozen meals behind them. But the space beside the last shelf felt deeper. There was a narrow gap between the shelf and the wall. I'd seen it 1,000 times. Just enough room for cleaning equipment. Tonight it looked wider. Dark. Cold air seeped from it in a steady stream. I leaned closer. The fluorescent light above flickered. And for a moment, just a moment, the gap looked like a hallway. Long. Fading into dim light somewhere beyond the store. I blinked. The shelf snapped back into its normal place. The wall was exactly where it should be. The gap was narrow again. Barely enough for a mop bucket. I stepped back slowly. The cold draft faded. The refrigerators hummed steadily. Everything was normal. I walked to the front of the store and stood behind the register. The bell above the door swayed slightly even though no one had opened it. I stared down aisle 4 again. It looked perfectly ordinary. But something about the direction of it felt wrong now. Not longer, just angled. Very slightly. As if the aisle wasn't pointing at the back wall anymore. As if it were pointing somewhere else entirely. A place just beyond the edge of the store. Somewhere north. And for the rest of the night, every time the refrigerators exhaled cold air, I could have sworn I heard another sound mixed into it. A faint bell. Opening.